We are honored to be joined by Junius Williams, who's the official Newark Historian. He's an author, a civil rights activist, host of a podcast called Everything's Political. Good to see you, Junius.
Good to see you too, Steve. It's been a while.
It has. And this is a really important segment because it's part of a series that we're doing simply called New Jersey Leaders Who Matter, Powering Equity and Social Justice. There are three leaders who we are going to feature. Ken Gibson, the great Mayor Ken Gibson of Newark, Amiri Baraka, playwright, poet, novelist, and also the Mayor of Newark today, Ras Baraka. Three Newark and New Jersey and American leaders who matter. Junius, let's start with Ken Gibson. We're going to be showing some pictures of these three folks that we're going to be talking about. Elected in 1970 as the Mayor of Newark, the first black mayor of a major northeastern city. Why was Ken Gibson so important beyond being the first in that regard?
Ken Gibson represented a power shift in the city of Newark. For some time, black people had been in the majority, and yet the official hierarchy for running the city didn't reflect that population. We had two councilmen, one at large and one for the Central Ward, and that was it. The police department was 95% white, mostly Irish and Italian. Most of the people in the city who worked in City Hall at the high positions were white.
And did not live in the city.
And so it was time for a change. So Ken was our choice. I was his first campaign manager. And what we had to do was to convince people that a black man could win. Despite the numbers, a lot of people just didn't believe it. And of course, Adenizio had a lot of friends, and the
previous mayor who went to jail for corruption and frankly being tied to the mob. But also Mayor Gibson, who I was honored to know as a young man growing up in Newark, he also brought a sense of calm to the city after the 1967 rebellion. Did he not?
Yes, I think that was probably the greatest gift that he had and that he used. Ken was very laid back, very calm. And I think that convinced a lot of white people that they didn't have anything to worry about. And that was important during that day because the city was very racially polarized. There was a man named Anthony Imperielli in the North Ward.
My neighborhood.
In your neighborhood, my neighborhood now, your father's neighborhood. As a matter of fact, your father and him had a run-in as to who was going to be the chairman of the Democratic Party, and your father won. So this was a time of racial polarization, unlike anything that I've seen until now. I would say that the Imperielli people were like the Proud Boys and the folks who stormed the White House. I'm sorry, the Capitol.
The Capitol. And then folks, check it out. It's not an understatement what Mr. Williams is sharing right now. It was a bad time. It just really was. But I want to ask you this about Amiri Baraka. Playwright, poet, but activist. His contribution, and by the way, I was honored to interview Mr. Baraka at NJPAC, I believe in the last year of his life. What was his greatest contribution in your view?
He combined art and politics like nobody else that I knew. He was a nationalist, but at the same time, he kept his eyes on the prize. The prize was to win the mayoralty and the majority of the city council. Now, we didn't do it at the first time, but eventually we did get the council as well, I think in '74, to be more representative of the people that were here. But Amiri Baraka was one of a kind. He had a national and international reputation as a poet, as a writer, as you said, of various kinds. But during the rebellion in 1967, a policeman hit him in the head and gave him a concussion, bloodied his head, and he became known thereafter for his politics, because he had a platform that he didn't have before. And he used it to help get Ken Gibson elected. Ken Gibson depended upon the organization that Baraka set up called the Committee for Unified Newark more than Ken Gibson wanted to admit. He did not, that there was something that was Baraka's idea, and it was called the Black and Puerto Rican Convention, at which time, for the election in 1970, people were supposed to come to that convention in 1969 and show their wares. Some people did, most people didn't. But by that time, most of us had decided we wanted Ken, and like all conventions, there was people liked Ken a lot. But at the same time, there was this idea, and I think that idea was probably one of the most, it was not only generous, but I think it was a very influential idea, and people ought to do it more.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I remember being a kid growing up in the city that year, that election, and I'm not going to go into this except to say, in the neighborhood I grew up in, and Junius Williams knows this better than most, in the neighborhood I grew up in 1970, in the race between Ken Gibson, who was an engineer, and Hugh Adenizio, Mayor Hugh Adenizio, who was indicted and ultimately went to jail for being, quote, mobbed up. In my neighborhood, largely Italian-American, virtually everyone voted for Hugh Adenizio. My father happened to go in a different direction and be supportive of Ken Gibson. But that being said, the argument was, even if he was corrupt, at least, quote, he was white. And that's how it was. And people, and Junius, am I overstating that before we move to Ras Baraka?
No.
That's basically the way it was.
The runoff between Adenizio and Ken Gibson was a campaign that Adenizio directed toward Amiri Baraka. It was strictly based on race. You can't trust Gibson because Gibson's got Baraka. Now, they didn't know that Gibson turned around and just kind of pushed Baraka aside. They didn't know he would do that at the time. But that was very important. We had, the other thing I wanted to say was we had a platform coming out of that convention. And that was a very important platform for us. But Ken more or less ran on what Ken wanted to run on.
So, by the way, in the time we have, and again, I wish we had more time, you are doing, with Ras Baraka, Mayor Baraka of Newark, you are involved in an initiative. What is it exactly?
The mayor wants to turn the 4th precinct, now 1st precinct, into a museum and an office building. But I'm going to talk about the museum because that's what I'm involved in. He wants to convert that place into a museum to contribute Newark's history, to talk about the civil rights history, to talk about the Black Power history, to talk about people's memories of what Newark was like and what they wanted to become. So it's going to be a people's museum, whatever the final title is. So that came out of the fact that he wanted to, people were saying, well, you ought to get rid of the police. You ought to defund the police. He said, no, we need the police. What we're going to do is to take part of the police budget and do 2 things with it. Number one, we're going to show that we can help create a culture of nonviolence in the city, but we're also going to do this we're going to do this museum.
Junius, let me ask you this. What would you say, and by the way, we've interviewed Mayor Baraka many times. Check out our website to see those interviews. What would you say his greatest contribution to date is as a New Jerseyan who matters greatly?
He tells the truth, and he has come from an activist household where his mother and his father had certain beliefs. The beliefs sometimes, most time, ran counter to what the traditional wisdom was, and he's now in a position where he can correct some of the wrongs that he sees. For example, this museum is a good example. The housing that he wants to build is called Kawaida Towers, which was a very controversial housing project in the North Ward. People said, well, the water is messed up. Well, he has been able to turn that around and have people, he had trained people from the city of Newark to come out and fix the housing where the water problem was existing. I'm trying to think of how many units of housing, how many units have done, but thousands have been corrected. The pipes have been changed where there was lead in those pipes. All those things combined make him a good mayor.
That is Junius Williams. This is part of our series that deals with New Jerseyans who matter. And I want to thank you for joining us. And by the way, check out Junius's his podcast called Everything's Political. Junius, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Steve Adubato. We'll see you next time.
State of Affairs with Steve Adubato is a production of the Caucus Educational Corporation. Funding has been provided by the Turrell Fund, supporting Reimagine Childcare. PNC, Grow Up Great. PSE&G, the Healthcare Foundation of New Jersey. The Fidelco Group. Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield of New Jersey. New Jersey Institute of Technology. MD Advantage Insurance Company. And by the New Jersey Education Association. Promotional support provided by NJ.com. And by the New Jersey Business and Industry Association.
New Jersey's early educators and childcare providers are more than twice as likely to live below the poverty line versus the general workforce. Reimagine Childcare, formed by a coalition in New Jersey, is dedicated to improving accessibility, affordability, and quality of childcare and reimagining the way we support these essential providers. Learn more by visiting reimaginechildcare.org.